Korah, who led people in rebellion against God and ultimately is judged for it. His sons, rather than go with their father, obey the one true God and stand by his side, and then become some of our most common biblical songwriters in the Bible. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Renewal Bible in a Year podcast. My name is Pastor PJ Arsvold, and I am thrilled to be back with you for week 7 of our reading. And we are in the book of Numbers, and we're going to be looking at a whole lot today. It is probably an underappreciated section of the Bible. There's a lot of very memorable things that happen that don't always get relayed or don't make it into children's Bibles, but I think you're going to be blessed and have a lot to wrestle with in this week's readings. Just a brief recap. So up until this point, Moses has led the people out of Egypt, right? God has led the people out of Egypt through Moses. They get out, they eventually get to Sinai. That's the mountain where Moses goes up and he gets the 10 Commandments. And they've been stationed at Sinai for quite a while. And they've been getting all of these laws about how the priesthood's going to work. And they've been consecrating Aaron and his sons, and they're getting all these instructions about sacrifices and how to live. And now in the book of Numbers, they've taken a census and they've gotten a command that they're going to leave Sinai. And in chapter 10, we were told that they're finally leaving Sinai. So if you just think big picture, since Egypt, you really left Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, got to Sinai, set up camp there. This is our second motion, right? We kind of went from Egypt to Sinai. Now we're setting Sinai out. And the reason I highlight that is because this is going to be a rough week for the Israelites. I mean, it's more than a week in their time, but as you and I read through the Bible, it's a pretty rough stretch. And what you're going to notice is immediately, and I mean immediately, we have issues. And this is a friendly reminder. I know I've said in the past, but in the Bible, there is one hero, and he is God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and everybody else falls woefully short. And we're going to see that especially today because chapter 10, Israel leaves Sinai, and then chapter 11, what do? They start complaining and they start grumbling about their misfortunes and they start talking about how rough they have it and how hungry they are. And then they do that thing where they reminisce and they think, oh, remember Egypt? Remember how we used to have cucumbers and melons and leeks? And as you're reading it, you just want to be like, you also had slavery and your children were executed. And I don't think you had all that yummy food, to be honest. But they've kind of talked up this past life once again. And they're wishing that they were back in Egypt. And they're complaining about the manna. And think about that. So God had given them this manna to feed them because they had no food. And now all of a sudden they're saying, oh, we just have this manna to look at. So they're complaining, they're grumbling, and they're complaining to Moses, and then Moses turns to the Lord and is like, how am I supposed to deal with this people, right? He's complaining to the Lord. He's going in prayer and saying, like, I can't bear the burden of all these people, right? This stiff-necked people who are constantly complaining. So then the Lord does this thing where he takes Moses and has him appoint 70 elders from the people, and they're to go before the Lord with Moses, and the Lord, I should say, is going to take some of the spirit that he's given Moses and place it upon the elders. So they're going to help share the burden that Moses is dealing with. So they're going to be able to speak for God and just withstand and lead the people, not in the way that Moses does fully. Moses is still going to be a very significant role, but God is helping distribute the responsibility and the leadership role a little bit. This is likely what is referenced when Jesus sends out 72 in the Gospel of Luke, when he sends out first his 12 to go and minister, and then he sends out 72 followers. And it's likely that 72 is mirroring the 70 here elders, but that's for another time. So you set this spirit upon the elders, and then the Lord basically tells the people, all right, fine, I'll give you meat, and you're going to have it more than you could possibly want. So he's going to send them quail, which is a bird. And we're told it's 3 feet deep. So 2 cubits, a cubit is 18 inches, 3 feet deep. So imagine just being up to your waist in dead birds that have plopped on the ground. And then we're told it's a day's journey around in every direction. So you think of a circle, and if you were to spend a day with your camp traveling as far as you can go for an entire day, That's how far this circle is each way in terms of how much quail. And it's 3 feet deep that whole way. So it's just an insane amount, right? So God is showing this isn't a fluke. This isn't like, oh no, we happen to stumble upon some food. God is showing this is all me. But God is clearly not happy about this because, again, up until this point, God continues to care for the people. He continues to provide for them. And so he actually strikes some down out of judgment. These who got so overcome by their hunger that they rebelled against God and complained against him. And so there's a judgment there, but God does give them meat to eat. So it's a really interesting thing. I'll just say one other thing about their longing for Egypt, and we'll see this a couple more times going forward. We've already seen to this point at times where they start to reminisce about Egypt. And Egypt serves as this, again, embodiment of their past life. When they were in slavery and things were not good, God has led them out of that. But at times when things are challenging or tough or they have to rely on God's word, they desire to go back to it. And I think that the analogous situation for Christians today, at least, would be sometimes, depending on your experience, being a Christian can be challenging, right? It means that things aren't always as comfortable, aren't always as fun as maybe we'd like, or sometimes temptation calls us and we see what it feels like we're missing out on. And I think sometimes there's a temptation to go back to Egypt. There's a temptation to go back to that slavery to sin that the New Testament talks about and reminisce about how good it was, when anyone who just came out of it would tell you, no, wait a minute, that was slavery. This is freedom. And yet when you're going through trials or hardships, sometimes you can just imagine that it was so good, even though it wasn't. So that would probably be the correlation for today. So there we had a little bit of the people complaining. Now we're going to actually have a little bit of an inside job in terms of grumbling and complaining, where Aaron and Miriam, so this is Moses' brother, Aaron, the high priest, and his sister Miriam, who's a prophetess and helps lead the people and lead the women specifically. She led them in a song in Exodus 15. They grumble against Moses and basically question his supreme authority amongst the group and say something to the effect of like, has the Lord only spoken through Moses? And it says that they grumble against him because of his Cushite wife. So we're not told exactly the whole background of the situation. When it says a Cushite wife, it could be that this was his wife, his Midian wife that he married in Exodus. Seems unlikely. It's not impossible, but seems unlikely as Cush and Midian were typically two different places. There's a whole discussion there. But there's a better chance that this is a second wife. Now, is this a second wife while his other wife is still alive, or has his first wife passed away and he's remarrying? We're not sure. If I had to personally guess, I would guess that his previous wife has passed away, as she has not been mentioned for quite some time and she will not get mentioned again. So I would venture to guess that he is a widower and that he's gotten remarried. That's just my best take on it. But regardless, what we do see is that this is really just, as one commentator put it, a smokescreen. At the end of the day, this isn't really about his wife. Aaron and Miriam are jealous of his place, and so they grumble against Moses. Now, the Lord hears this, and he is not having any of this. And so he calls out Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, and has this remarkable statement about how when I speak to somebody, I give them visions and stuff, but it's not that way with Moses. I speak to him like face to face, right? Like a friend speaks to a friend, and he has beheld my form and my glory. Right? Moses has a very special role that God is trying to drive home here. And so God leaves, and then we see that Miriam has now become leprous. She has leprosy, which if you remember previously, leprosy is a very serious indictment. Like it's a very rough experience because you are unclean, you're unfit to enter God's presence, and you're cast out from the people. Now you may wonder, all right, wait a minute. Aaron and Miriam were both complaining. Why is Miriam the one who has to get punished? And I think the reason is actually quite simple. It's because if Aaron had leprosy, Aaron could no longer do the duties of the high priest. Okay, if Aaron had leprosy, he could no longer go in and offer the sacrifices that only a high priest can offer, and specifically than other priests can offer. And so, while it seems like there's a one-sided punishment, Aaron very much views this as an us punishment. He asked Moses, basically, will the Lord forgive us? So even when he sees Miriam have leprosy, Aaron knows that he's guilty. Again, the Lord is just not punishing his whole people and depriving their sacrifices on account of this. So Moses prays on behalf of Aaron and Miriam, and the Lord forgives, but does basically say that Miriam's going to have to spend a week outside of the camp. So she's leprous. She spends a week, and then by the end of the week, she is no longer leprous, and she's purified, and she comes back in. And one of my favorite people in the Bible is Moses. I think that there's a lot to admire. Again, knowing that Moses is not the hero of the story, and we'll see that including today. However, I just do want to highlight how remarkable it is. And you'll notice this about Moses. You'll notice this with Aaron. How many times they're challenged. And I'll say specifically Moses is challenged or called out, or somebody is trying to question his authority or his position. And Moses intercedes for that person. So again, imagine your brother and your sister, your brother the priest, your sister the prophetess. So prophet and priest both questioning you, your brother and your sister both questioning you and challenging your authority, and your response is to pray for their forgiveness. Again, an incredible picture of Jesus there, an incredible testament to Moses' character. And then we get into a very important event in chapter 13. So this is the spying out of the promised land, so the land of Canaan. So what happens is the people take one person of every tribe. So all 12 tribes of Israel, one man from each tribe heads into the land to spy it out, to see what the people are like, to see what the land is like. Again, you got to remember, these people were all born in Egypt. All they've ever been told about this land is through God's revelation. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. It's very fruitful, right? So they've heard about it, but now they're sending people in to actually see it for the first time. So this is a cool moment because you're like, oh my gosh, they're next to the promised land. They're within striking distance. Let's go check it out. So they send in these 12 spies to go take a look. They're there for 40 days, and they gather up some fruit of the land. They bring back some fruit and look at this and all the stuff we gathered. And they say, yes, it flows with milk and honey, just like God said. And it's really good. But the people there are numerous and they're strong and their cities are fortified. And there's no way that we're going to be able to take these cities. Now, there's two people that don't go with this. So there's two people who vouch for going into the land, and that's Caleb and Joshua. So Caleb and Joshua are sent as part of these spies, Caleb being of the tribe of Judah, and they go in and they say, no, this is a really good land. We can take it, right? If the Lord delights in us, right? He promised it to us. If the Lord delights in us, he will let us get in. And yet the people hear the 10 who dissent, who say, no, we can't go. And they basically say, the people say, no, we can't do it. And I want to highlight a couple things. First off, those 10 highlight that there are these men of great stature, these sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. This is a callback all the way back to Genesis chapter 5. Right before the flood, we're told we have this really interesting story about how the sons of God and the daughters of man intermarry. And you have this picture of those who are for God and those who are not mixing, but we're told that their offspring are these Nephilim, or it's often translated these giants. And if you want to go more into it, I'm happy to dive in or answer some questions. But the long and short is there are these groups of people then that come out of that we're told are of this great stature. They're giants, and they're almost all wicked. They're going to almost all be opponents to God's people. You can see kind of the results of this terrible intermarriage. And so you have these sons of Anak, these giants that are there. And so we can't defeat them. They're of this great height. We can't do it. And the 10 say we're like grasshoppers to them, right? So then in chapter 14, you have the people hear this report and they say, oh my gosh, it would have been better for us to die in Egypt. So again, look, just like we talked about, we wish we were in Egypt. We wish we were back in slavery. It was so much better there than what's happening now. So much so they get to the point where they say, our bodies should have died in the wilderness, right? That would have been better for us than to try and fight these guys and lose. Our little ones are going to be like prey to them. They're just going to devour our children. And so they decide we need to appoint a leader to bring us back to Egypt, which is insane again. So think of all they've experienced, right? Everyone here, for the most part, has seen God's deliverance through the plagues, through the parting of the Red Sea, through miraculous feedings and providing of water. I mean, God has shown them so many things, and now they're like, let's get a leader and head back to Egypt. Joshua and Caleb again say, no, let's go, right? They believe that if the Lord is with us, we're going to do this, right? He's the one who's going to deliver us, and they're going to be like bread to us. You think we're grasshoppers to those guys? Well, if the Lord's with us, then we can devour them. We're going to be the ones who are victorious. Now, the people, they're so mad at Joshua and Caleb for giving this report and for encouraging them to do this, they're going to stone them. They seek to stone Joshua and Caleb until the glory of the Lord appears and kind of cuts off the whole scene. And basically the Lord says to Moses, I shouldn't have brought this people up. I'm going to wipe them all out and I'll make you a great nation, right? So again, the people who are now questioning Moses, once again, God is like, they have turned from me. They've lost faith. They deserve to be punished. And Moses, I'll make you the father of a nation. Just like I had picked Abraham. Now it's going to be just you, Moses. But Moses once again intercedes for them and prays that they would be forgiven. And then I love that when Moses is praying to the Lord, he reminds God of his own promises. He says, as you promised, and he references Exodus 34. He says, as you promised, you are slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and mercy. And so he's reminding God of what God has already promised. I want to highlight that for a second. And it's not that God has forgotten. It's not that God only keeps his promises if people remember them. But there's something about the walk with God in which we are invited to speak back his promises. God, you said this. You said you were with me till the end. Please, I don't feel you here. Help me. Remind me that you are here, right? Lord, you've promised me that you take my sin farther than the east is from the west. I feel the guilt and the shame of my sin. Please forgive me and remember and remind me that my guilt and shame and sin is gone. So I think there's something beautiful about taking the promises of God and speaking them back to him, not because God has forgotten, but because we too often forget. So Moses responds to God by reminding God, by praying back the promises God has already made. And then God ultimately forgives the people of Israel. He's not going to prevent Israel from reaching the promised land. However, there will be judgment now for those who saw his works in Egypt and then broke faith. So he says, none of those who saw what I did in Egypt will see the land of Canaan. So everybody who was in that census at the beginning of the book of Numbers, above a certain age, is going to die in the wilderness. And this is kind of like God saying, this is what you wanted, fine, have it. So the people said, our bodies, we're going to die in the wilderness. It would have been better. God says, great, you're going to wander in the wilderness, and I'm going to let you wander until all of you who didn't trust me ultimately die in the wilderness. You said your children will become prey. It's actually going to be your children who are going to be the ones to enter the promised land. These ones that you thought were going to be devoured, they're going to be the ones doing the devouring. So anyone who's under 20 still has a chance to see the promised land, but everybody above that age has lost the right to the promised land. They forfeited it. And for the 40 days that the spies have scouted, it's going to be 40 years, I should say, in the wilderness. And so you see this judgment. The people, God had brought them up to the promised land, and when he said, great, let's go in, they didn't trust him. And as a result, they forfeited their right to go in, the promise. It's going to go to their children. So God is still being faithful to his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob, that he's going to bring their descendants into this promised land. But the generation that came out of Egypt is not going to be the generation to walk into Canaan. Okay? And specifically the 10 men then who brought back this poor report, they die by a plague. So Joshua and Caleb are spared. They live, but the other 10 die by a plague. And it shows us, again, when you have a responsibility, and specifically when you lead other people to stumble, there is a harsh punishment for that. And again, Jesus will go so far to say that whoever were to cause one of these little ones to stumble, think of a little child, whoever leads them away, whoever causes them to stumble in faith and in life and to harm such, it would be better for him to have a millstone tied around his neck. So there's something really serious about when you do something that causes others to stumble, there is a punishment for that. So these 10 men are struck down, except for the 2 that live are Joshua and Caleb. And then what happens is the people start to panic. They realize, oh no, what have we done? We should have gone in. So then they say, the Lord promised us this land. Let's go take it now. And Moses is like, no, it's too late, right? Listen to the Lord. He told you to go in. You didn't. Now he's telling you you can't go in right now. And the people try anyways, and they're chased off and they can't get in. So it's, again, even now, they're not trusting the Lord. They're not listening to him. They don't want to deal with the consequences of what they've done. And so we kind of are left with this pivotal moment. We were on the way to the promised land. Everything from Exodus through Leviticus up to Numbers so far has led us towards the promised land. And we're at the doorstep. And now we have to turn back and we have to go wander for a while. Which leads us to a bit of a hard turn when it comes to chapter 15, where now we're going to get some more laws for a chapter. So we have some laws about sacrificial laws, and you can read those again. A lot of it is similar to what we read about in Leviticus. There's a few nuances, some new details we can pick up on. Again, talk about unintentional sinning. So again, when one stumbles, one sins, breaks the law, there's forgiveness. You go through the right sacrifices. But there's also this idea of what can be referred to as high hand sinning or intentional sinning. This idea of if I'm aware that this is wrong and I just don't care, we're told that person should be cut off from the people. Okay, so there's a difference. As Christians, if you're a Christian, we believe that everyone is going to sin in this lifetime. Even as a Christian, you are going to at times sin. You're going to give into temptation. You're going to lose your cool. You're going to stumble. But there is something vastly different between that, where I sinned and I remorsed and I repented and I asked God for forgiveness. There's a big difference between that and this idea of, I know that God doesn't want me to do this, or I know God has told me not to through the scriptures, or Jesus has commanded not to, but I just don't care. I just want to do it my way. And he says here, God says that person should be cut off from the people. And we actually see that play out in 1 Corinthians, where the Christian church has a man who is sleeping with his father's wife, so presumably his stepmother, and Paul says, you need to kick him out of the church. He knows he should not do that, and he's going on doing it. You need to kick him out of the church with the hope and for the purpose that he will realize what he's doing and he will come back and repent. So even then, it's out of love, because in this current state, you're going the wrong way, man. But we see that kind of play out in the New Testament sense of God's people are always going to sin. No Christian is without sin in this lifetime. However, there's a big difference between sinning and asking for forgiveness and repentance and asking God to help them do better, and this idea of just intentionally not caring, I'm just going to do what I want to do. We have this story then about somebody who's breaking the Sabbath. So again, we have an intentional sinning, somebody who is saying, I don't care that the Lord said not to work on the Sabbath. I'm going to go pick up some sticks. And God, what he promised, right? This was not news to anyone. It's already been very clear. If you break the Sabbath, the penalty is the death penalty, and that is what happens to this man. And then we're told about these tassels on your clothes to remind you to follow the commandments of God and not to follow one's own heart and eyes, which you're tempted to go after. So again, to follow God's command, the things that he's commanded, the good things that he's promised and he desires for us, that over what I want in my heart, my desires, and my eyes, and what I think is right. Eyes are kind of like a stand-in for judgment, you could say, right? So if you think of what we'll see later, doing right in your own eyes becomes a common refrain later in the Bible. This idea of what's right in my eyes being kind of my judgment, what I think is best. So not letting those dictate the show, but rather letting God's commands dictate the show. And then in chapter 16, we have a very big event. This is a rebellion. So now after all of this, you think of narrative-wise, we just had the people at the doorstep of the promised land. They broke faith. God is turning them away from the promised land. You can imagine that if you're part of that group, you're thinking, what? I'm not going to get into the promised land anymore? Like, this is terrible. And so you have these men who lead a rebellion. So we're told that there's Korah, who comes from the tribe of Levi. And then there is Dathan and Abiram and On, who are from the tribe of Reuben. And they're going to lead along with 250 chiefs. So again, it's not a small group. This is a large rebellion. You have a lot of influential leaders led by these four men who are rebelling against God, and rebelling specifically in this moment against Moses and Aaron. And it's really interesting. Basically, their accusation is similar to what Aaron and Miriam said against Moses. They say this really interesting thing. They say, we're all holy. We're all God's holy people. So why do you put yourself above us? And it's a really interesting argument, right? Like, we're all part of God's people. Why do you get to be in charge? What have you done? You brought us to the promised land just so we could turn around? That's terrible. right? You just brought us out here to die. And so they're trying to usurp their authority and they're trying to challenge their authority. I think there's a lesson to be learned as Christians. Every Christian is a holy child of God. And yet, even within that, God has established certain roles of authority, right? So he puts pastors / bishops / overseers, shepherds, all the words you want to use, elders in the Bible, as this position of authority in his church. Not because that person is more holy, not because that person is inherently better, but God is a God of order, and he is established in order where there are people of different positions and authority. That's how it's designed to be. And God, in this case, has specifically picked out Moses and Aaron to be those leaders. So again, you go back to Exodus. God called Moses through the burning bush, and he picked Aaron as the high priest. God has picked them to be his leaders for the people, but the people don't want it. They want to usurp it. So Moses talks to, sons of Levi. So to Korah and his kind of crowd, he's looking at him and saying, you guys get to serve in the temple. You are like the Lord's, you've been separated from the Lord's people as this special role to work in the tabernacle. And now you want the priesthood that Aaron has. So if you think about it, within the tribe of Levi, only Aaron's family gets to be priests. And so you have Korah kind of embodying the Levites trying to usurp the priesthood. Why do you get to be the priests? We should get to be too. And then you also have these Reubenites who, if you think of it, Reuben is the firstborn of Jacob. And so they have a certain firstborn attitude of we should be the leaders. And you think back to Reuben trying to usurp his father by sleeping with one of his father's wives. And so you have this kind of playing out here in this story where Reuben's sons, Dathan and Abiram, are both conspiring against, and they're trying to usurp, and they say, we want this position, we should be leading the people. And Moses is telling them, it's against the Lord you're grumbling. It's not me and Aaron. Like, you are challenging the way that the Lord has done this. So he has them take these censers with fire and incense as if they're offering a sacrifice, right? So you have all these people who are kind of usurping, take these chiefs, take these censers, which are used for sacrificing and fire and incense burning, and basically take these censers. And then the Lord says to Moses and Aaron, he's going to consume them all, right? Again, man, I just went through this, right? The people just didn't listen to me. And so now I turned, I didn't destroy them, but now here they are rebelling against me and how I've established it again. So the Lord's going to consume them all. Again, Moses and Aaron are interceding for the people who are challenging their authority. Again, remarkable. Moses and Aaron are praying for the people that are trying to usurp them. And again, echoes of Jesus praying for the forgiveness of those who are crucifying him on the cross. So Moses and Aaron intercede, and basically God gives everyone an opportunity. All right, so basically Korah and all of this conspiracy, rebellion, they're there. If you're on the Lord's side, get away from them. The Lord's going to pronounce judgment on them. You can stay over there or you can leave. And this is anyone, right? If you want to try and challenge the way God set it up, you stay over there. Otherwise, get away from their camps. And then Moses says, here's how you're going to know that the Lord is doing this. If they just die a natural death, like anybody dies, then the Lord's clearly not with me. But if it's a special, something so nobody's ever seen before, then you know that this was the Lord's doing. And what you have is like the earth splitting, like almost like an earthquake, but the earth parts like a mouth. Korah and all of those who are with him fall in, and then the earth closes up around him. So imagine literally the earth just like a mouth just opens up and swallows him whole and all of his people. And then the fire from the tabernacle comes out and consumes the 250 chiefs that were conspiring too. So again, they weren't supposed to, they're not priests. They're not supposed to be doing that. And so now the Lord is consuming them for their part in the rebellion. So Korah and his camp are swallowed. These chiefs are consumed by fire. And then Moses says that these censers have become holy. And so they've been this special thing. The consuming, purifying fire of God has consumed these chiefs, and these censers that were used have now become significant. And so they end up pounding them into a covering for the altar. So when people see the altar, it's made out of these censers that were wrongfully used by these conspirators. And so, conspirators, I should say. And so it serves as a reminder to all people that this is a job for the priest, not for anyone else. The people grumble. They're still like, they're worried about this. So they're like, how dare you? You're just going to kill us all. You killed Korah. You killed these chiefs. Again, they just don't get it. And so basically Moses and Aaron make atonement because as soon as Moses hears this, he knows that they're grumbling. They're breaching faith with God again. And so he tells Aaron, you go take a censer and go make atonement for the people. Aaron runs in and makes atonement for the people. And there's a plague going through, right, as judgment against their unfaith and their distrust and their grumbling. And where Aaron stands basically stops the plague from spreading. So you can imagine this crazy sight of a plague coming and just striking people down. Then Aaron jumps in and stands in the gap, and then everyone behind him remains alive. So again, picture Jesus standing. What's the difference between being dead or alive? Jesus standing in the middle making atonement for you, right? That's the picture here. Aaron is standing there with the censer making atonement, all dead bodies on one side, but then he stands there and makes atonement, and everyone else lives. And we're told that just shy of 15,000 people die. So again, they're dying because of their own sin. They're dying because they just keep rebelling against the Lord. They keep turning away from him. They keep not trusting him. They keep trying to go against him and all of this. And so you see this judgment play out. And then in chapter 17, to show that Aaron's family is the priests. The Levites are the tabernacle workers, right? Just so we're all clear on this, they take one staff from a chief from every tribe, including Aaron, for the Levites. They carve their name into it. So you have somebody from Reuben, you have somebody from Dan, you have somebody from Manasseh, all of these tribes. They each take a staff. So again, just think of like a wooden stick that you would use to like walk with. And they all write their name on it, and they put it in the tent. And then when they bring them out, you can see that Aaron's staff has now budded almonds. And so you think of a stick that's dead wood. It has now come to life and sprouted. And it's a picture that God has chosen Aaron's family to be the priests. Lest anyone have any doubts, look at this miracle I just worked. And then they hang on to that staff as a reminder and a memorial going forward. So throughout the generations, they can look at this staff that Aaron had that reminds them Aaron's family is the priest. And then building off that reestablishment of Aaron and his family as the priests and the Levites as the tabernacle workers, we have a list of duties in chapter 18 that again just talks about what they're responsible for. You're responsible for the sanctuary and the priesthood. Priesthood is the one to their gift. Nobody else is supposed to come near. Nobody else is supposed to be offering these sacrifices except for them. And then we're told that they can eat of these sacrifices. So that's kind of their payment, you could say, is that they get to partake in some of the eating. And they're told that you will have no other inheritance or portion amongst the people of Israel. You're not going to have swaths of land or inheritances because I am your inheritance and your portion. And the priests are supposed to be satisfied with that. That is enough. And then we're told that the Levites, as part of their payment for their duties in the tabernacle, receive what's called a tithe. So when people have income, when they grow their food, whatever it is, they give 1/10 right off the top to the tabernacle or later to the temple. And that goes to paying the Levites. So again, the Levites aren't going to have a ton of fields. Like their duties, they're not able to go venture out in commerce and business or agriculture. Their job is to work in the tabernacle. And the way that they're going to make their living is that as people come in and they produce things, they give 1/10 to the tabernacle, and that goes to the Levites. And then really cool, we're told that the Levites have to tithe, and we're told it's called a tithe of a tithe. So people produce their food, they give 1/10 to the tabernacle. That helps pay the Levites so they can eat, right? And then we're told that the Levites, before they do anything with that, they take that payment and they tithe off of it, and they give 1/10 back to the tabernacle. And so the corollary for today would be that even church workers who make their living based off of other people's gifts and offerings still should be giving an offering to the church, right back. Just like anybody, everything we get is from the Lord. Let me give some back. So that would be kind of it's cool that even in the Old Testament, you see that for the Levites. People's tithe, they're going to pay you, but you also need to tithe off of that as an act of trust and obedience as well. Chapter 19, there's some more stuff about purification and cleanliness. We talked about that quite a bit last week, but if you have questions, let me know. And then chapter 20, this is going to be significant. So first off, Miriam dies. So if you think of the big three leaders, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, the first one has just died. Miriam dies, and they mourn. And then they get to a place called Meribah. And the people are complaining once again. What else is new? And the Lord tells Moses, go in front of the people with Aaron, take the staff that you have, and speak to the rock, and the rock will pour forth water. So if you remember back in Exodus chapter 17, there was this moment the people were thirsty, and God commanded Moses to strike a rock with his staff, and water would pour out. This time, God tells him to speak to the rock, and water will come out. Moses gets up there, and he basically says, all right, everyone, he's sick of all the grumbling, right? And so he's frustrated, and he says, basically, check this out, right? Hear now, you rebels. So he's calling them rebels. Shall we bring water for you out of the rock? But instead of speaking to it, he strikes it twice. He hits it. Very reminiscent of the first time that he was told to strike it, and he did. Now he's told to speak. And as soon as he does this, water comes forth, the people drink, and the Lord tells him, because you did not treat me as holy in the eyes of the people, you will not enter the promised land. This is a really tough spot for me. Because the Lord is just and he is righteous. But I definitely feel for Moses. You think of all that he's dealt with, all that he's done, all the times the people have rebelled against God, have questioned his authority, and he's interceded for them, and he's pleaded with the Lord. And in this moment where Moses is so frustrated, he's so angry at the people and probably his position in the middle of all of this, that the Lord tells him, you need to speak to the rock and it'll pour forth water. And Moses goes up and he disobeys. He does something different. He hits the rock out of frustration. I don't know. But in doing so, he did not show the people what it looks like to obey God's word. He disobeyed. Might seem small to us, but in the eyes of the people and in the eyes of God, he is now shown that he's not obeying God's word verbatim. He's taken it upon himself to act how he wants to. And so God says, you forfeited your role in the promised land. You're not going to enter. And so because of that, right, we're already told that most of this people are not going to enter the promised land. Now we're told that Moses, and we'll see too, Aaron, because of his part in this, by being there and knowing the command and not holding Moses to that, they're not going to enter the promised land either. And so when we enter the promised land in the book of Joshua, it's going to be a whole new generation. And Moses and Aaron are going to give way to new leaders, and the current generation that came out of Egypt are going to give way to the next generation. So, bummer moment for Moses and a really sad moment. But again, just to reiterate, when you have a position of responsibility, when you are a leader that God has established, all the more important that you obey God's word and you keep yourself to that standard. Again, Moses he's not struck down dead in this case, and he's not cast to hell or something. But because of this, there's consequences, and he's not going to enter the promised land, at least in that lifetime. And then in chapter 20 still, we have Israel trying to go through the land of Edom. So they're wandering around. If you remember, Edom descends from the people of Esau. So Israel comes from Israel, who's also Jacob. Edom comes from Esau. So these two twin brothers, right? These quarreling brothers. And it's interesting because when Israel comes up, they say, thus says your brother, right? So they have a shared history, and they know this. This is true when you look at the biblical nations. They're aware of who we came from, our former relations with other people. They have an understanding of this history. And that doesn't mean that they can't progress or improve things, or if somebody goes back and breaches faith that they don't adjust. But there is this acknowledgement of history. So they're going to refer to Edom or Esau or Seir, S-I-E-R, Mount Seir. It's kind of a stand-in for Edom or Esau. They're going to refer to that as their brother. So they say, hey, it's your brother here. It's Israel here. Jacob here, Esau. Can we come through? We're going to go on the King's Highway, which was this big trade route, most likely, that goes from like Damascus to Arabia. So basically they're saying, we're not going to go through all your fields. We're not going to cut through your cities and mess with your stuff. But you know that big road that everyone travels on? Can we just go through? We won't mess with anything. We just need to get through. And Edom says no. Right? You think of these quarreling brothers, the rivalry says, no, you're not coming through. You stay out. So they have to go a different way. And then Aaron dies, and we're told that it was partially because of what happened at Meribah, because Moses broke faith, but it was also Moses and Aaron, because they were both told this command. He cannot enter the promised land. Eleazar, his son, takes over the high priesthood. So again, there's Aaron's family comprises the priests, but there's always one high priest, one who stands at kind of the very top of this system or this whole setup. And so you have Eleazar taking over as the high priest. They take the high priestly gowns off of Aaron. They put them on Eleazar. It's this passing of the torch. And then he dies on Mount Hor, and they weep for 30 days. So now out of those big three, we've lost Miriam, we've lost Aaron, and Moses is kind of the last of the OGs leading the way. Then as we get into chapter 21, we start to get some battle conflict. So we're told that there's this Canaanite, the king of Arad, who heard that Israel was coming and took captive. So he comes in and he kidnaps people from Israel. He kidnaps some of their members, and Israel vows this vow and asks the Lord, basically, if you will deliver them back, we can return our captives, we can defeat them, we will destroy all of them, we'll wipe them out, which sounds harsh. And I just want to say next week in particular, I'm going to spend a chunk of time talking about how we understand some of the violence and the war that's coming. But again, I'm just going to say this. God is judging the Canaanites for their sin. So when we have this king of Arad who captures these captives, he's done a lot more, and his people have done a lot more sin than just that, right? God is pronouncing judgment on them. And so basically Israel says, they've kidnapped our people wrongfully. We didn't pick a fight with them. We were just minding our own business. Basically, will you please deliver them back to us, and we will destroy their city. And that's what happens. Again, I'm going to next week do a bit of a deep dive into some of the violence and conquest. But then you have more wandering, you have more grumbling from the people, and then you have this moment where, again, as the people are grumbling, the Lord, as a judgment against them, sends fiery serpents or poisonous snakes, and they start biting the people, and people start dying. And the people cry out to Moses for help, and Moses asks the Lord for help, and they say, please save us from these snakes. And what the Lord does is he has Moses make this bronze serpent, this bronze snake. And what happens is when the people get bit, if they look to this bronze serpent, they will live. So by looking at it, you're not going to die of the venom of the snakes. A couple interesting notes. First off, notice how they asked basically that the snakes be taken away. The Lord does not do that. They're still getting inflicted by these snake bites for their grumbling, but he doesn't allow it to kill them anymore, right? So they're still suffering, but God is saving them in the midst of their suffering. Second off, it's interesting that God has them make a picture of the very thing that they're trying to be rescued from. And this ties into Jesus, who is specifically compared to this moment. That just as that bronze serpent was lifted up in the wilderness and looking to it, people were saved. In the midst of suffering and death, you look to Jesus, who is the embodiment on the cross of suffering and death, and you are saved. So it's a really cool preview of what's going to happen in Jesus' ministry. I have these snakes biting me. Let me look to this lifted up snake to live. Just like in my life, we suffer from sin and death. Let me look to this one who's bearing the weight of sin of the world and is dying on a cross, and I'm going to live. And so kind of a cool preview going on there. Then as we're traveling, we have a couple songs, one about a well and one that comes from what's called the Book of the Wars of Yahweh. This is the only reference to this book. Interestingly, as we go through the Bible, you're going to see a couple times where books are referenced that we don't have. And so it'll say, these are recorded in the prophecies of Iddo. And you're like, I don't have a book of Iddo in my Bible. So this is one of those cases. It's presumably the Book of the Wars of Yahweh, or the Book of the Wars of the Lord. It's probably a song book that recounted some of these victories and some of these battles. We're not told much more about it, but just wanted to highlight that for you. Again, you have this song about this well. And then you have some more battling. So you have King Sihon, king of the Amorites. So he comes out, he fights and attacks Israel. So again, Israel's not looking for this fight, but Sihon comes and attacks them. And then as a retaliation, Israel battles them, defeats them, and then takes over their cities. And then right after that, you have Og, king of Bashan, who does the same thing. He comes, tries to attack Israel, trying to drive them away, and Israel wins and they take over their cities. This is interesting for a couple of reasons, because what you have now is Israel starting to take cities that are not part of the promised land. So both of these two kings attacked Israel, and in doing so brought battle upon themselves and lost and forfeited their cities, and Israel inhabited them. And that's going to come into play in a little bit. But you start to see that what we're going to end up seeing as the people of Israel's borders and their territory is bigger than the promised land that was originally promised. Kind of interesting there. Chapter 22, we have a really interesting story. We have this king of Moab, Balak. And Moab is this neighboring nation They descend from one of the daughters of Lot. If you remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot ends up having children with both of his daughters, and one of his daughters becomes the kind of mother of the people of Moab. So this ties back to Lot. And Balak sees what's happening with Israel here, and he's scared. So he sends for this prophet Balaam to come and curse them. And he says, there's this people that cover the face of the earth. And I know, Balaam, whoever you bless will be blessed, and whoever you curse will be cursed, right? So he's actually invoking the language of the promise given to Abraham back in Genesis 12. Whoever blesses you will be blessed. Whoever curses you will be cursed. So Balaam inquires of the Lord, hey, somebody came asking me to do this. What do I do? And the Lord makes it very clear. Do not do it. These are a blessed people. Okay? End of story. These are a blessed people. Don't curse them. I want to make that very clear because as you read this story, it might seem like God's being a little two-minded. And I want to try and help us navigate that. Because what happens is the messengers go back to Balak. They tell him. And Balak sends more money, more princes, more honor. Basically says, hey, try and convince him, right? Make him an offer he can't refuse. Balaam then goes to the Lord a second time and says, hey, should I go with them? And interestingly, the Lord says, go with them, but it's going to become very clear that he's not happy that Balaam's going. So you might wonder, why is he letting him go if he doesn't want him to go? Which is a great question. And that's why I first just want to highlight the Lord made his answer very clear the first time. Just imagine if you asked the Lord, hey, somebody asked if I could curse those people. Can I curse them? And the Lord said, do not curse them. Do not go with them. That people that he wants to curse, they're my blessed people. Then imagine the same people came back to you again and said, hey, would you do it for more money? And then you're like, hey, Lord, can I curse them? Right? You shouldn't be asking the question. The Lord has made the answer abundantly clear. And I want to highlight this because this is going to be wrapped up. The New Testament actually is going to reference Balaam. Balaam becomes a very interesting character. We're going to see him pop up later in the story again too. But so when presented with more money, more wealth and honor, he goes to the Lord a second time. And this time the Lord allows him to go. Now it's going to be clear the Lord is not happy he's going, but the Lord is going to work even Balaam's greed to his own devices. So Balaam starts going. He's riding a donkey. And then the Lord is not happy that he's going, right? He shouldn't have been asking in the second place, I guess. And so he puts this angel there to strike Balaam down, right? So you almost think back to the Garden of Eden when God set up an angel with a flaming sword. There's an angel here with a sword who's going to strike Balaam down. Now Balaam can't see the angel, but his donkey can. So there's this whole funny cat and mouse game where the donkey's trying not to go, and then Balaam's trying to get him to go, and they're getting really mad. And then, crazily enough, the donkey talks. The Lord opens the donkey's mouth, and he's basically like, what are you kicking me for? What are you hitting me for? And Balaam's like, you're not going, which, again, is just hilarious to think that Balaam just rolled with it, right? I would be like, talking donkey. But Balaam just talks back to his donkey, and then the Lord opens Balaam's eyes to see the angel, and he realizes that he would have died, and that the donkey was actually saving his life. But then what's crazy is after all of that, right? So the Lord has made it abundantly clear, I'm not happy you're on this journey, but then he allows him to go forward. Because again, the Lord has something, since we're here, since you're doing this, I'm going to use this for my glory and for my good. So long story short, Balaam gets to Balak, and Balak says, hey, look at those people. I need you to curse them. And what proceeds is that Balaam ends up blessing Israel 4 times. So God takes this curse for hire and turns it into a blessing for his people. And Balaam stands up and he blesses them. He references them as the dust of the earth, which is a callback to the promise to Abraham, again in Genesis 12, that his descendants would be as the dust of the earth. And so, again, you see this fulfillment of God's promises as the people are approaching the promised land. He references them as a lion. They have a scepter. There's all of these blessings. And then again, he says there in chapter 24, verse 9, bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. So again, that Abrahamic blessing is playing out here for the people of Israel in the book of Numbers. And then Balaam is told by Balak that the Lord or Yahweh has held back honor from you. Basically, he's saying well, if you can only do what the Lord tells you to do, then I guess the Lord doesn't want you to be honored. And again, it's a good reminder of who are we trying to please? People of man and the honor and wealth of this world, or the Lord? And so then we're told again, one final promise, one final blessing, and there's also baked into it kind of a judgment against Moab, that's Balak's people, Edom, the Amalekites, the Kenites. So again, some of these people who are opposing Israel or having problems or whatever, the Lord is blessing Israel and pronouncing that there's going to be challenge or judgment for those who have opposed God's people. Now, I just want to flag Balaam because he will come back in next week's reading in a very unfortunate way. But as soon as we get done with chapter 24, you have Balaam blessing Israel. Chapter 25, you have this really sad point in Israel's history where you have this place of Peor, P-E-O-R. And we're told that there, the people of Israel went after the Baal of Peor. Now, Baal, B-A-A-L, is a word that means Lord. It's a word that can mean a god, and it can also mean a specific god. So as we'll see with the Canaanites later, there's going to be a specific god they refer to as Baal. But when we hear something like the Baal of Peor, we're saying the god of that place, the god that is worshipped there. And so the people, after all that the Lord has done, start worshiping somebody else's god. They start taking the god of Peor and Moab because of the Moabites and the Midianites that are there. And we're told that they take wives from the land, and those wives lead them to false belief. They lead them into idolatry. And so this is a terrible breach of faith. This is a really significant moment because you see the danger in this intermarriage. You see the danger in believing in any other Lord, right? Any other Baal, any other God. That the people have, once again, just broken faith. Now, not everyone does, but we're told a number of them do. And again, I'm going to talk more about maybe some violence and stuff next week, but you have here where Phinehas, who is Eleazar's son, so that would be Aaron's grandson, executes God's judgment against a man and his Midianite wife who have broken faith and have brought a plague and judgment upon God's people due to their idolatry and due to their leading people astray. Phinehas executes them, and that's part of God's judgment against it. And again, I just want to stress, not that maybe we shouldn't feel queasy with some of these stories or kind of wrestle with this, but I just want to highlight that God made it abundantly clear well before to the people that idolatry, the worship of other gods, is punishable by death. If they were left in Egypt, they would be dead by now. They would have been worked to death. God could have struck them down many times, but he delivered them, he saved them, and said, if you follow my word, you listen to my commands, things will go well. If you break faith, if you go astray, then punishment will come, right? And specifically that idolatry is one of those things punishable by death. And we see that play out here. And then 24,000 end up dying due to a plague. So really sad state. And Peor and the whole situation with the Baal of Peor, again, it's going to be referenced later in next week's reading, and it's going to come back in the New Testament. I'll talk about it more next week, but that moment is going to be something that the New Testament apostles are going to highlight for us as something for Christians to learn from. In chapter 26, then, we have another census being taken. So again, the book of Numbers actually is quite a bit of interesting story, but we do have some censuses. So we started in chapter 2 with the census of the people, all of those of fighting age. I think it was about 603,550. And now in chapter 26, we're getting a new generation. So we're taking a new census, and we're told that there's 601,730. So at this point, we have lost those who came from Egypt. We have a new generation that has grown up. We've had many die from judgment due to their own sin, and yet God has continued to multiply them. That there's a new generation that has grown up, that has been born, that has been raised. And so we're down 2,000 fighting age men, but we're still at over 600,000. So again, God has preserved his people even in the midst of their judgment. A couple of things I want to highlight in this census too is we're told in this census we're recalled for us the rebellion led by Korah, but we're told that the sons of Korah did not die in that rebellion. And I want to just sit with that for a second, because if you remember in the rebellion, Moses gave the people an opportunity. You can stand by Korah and face judgment, or you can leave. So here we see, we didn't know this at the time, but Korah's sons did not stand with him. They obeyed God over even their own father. And what's remarkable is, as you've been reading the Psalms, if you've been paying attention to, some of the Psalms have authorship attached to them, some from David, a couple from Moses. and a bunch of them come from the sons of Korah. And so you have this remarkable legacy. Korah, who led people in rebellion against God and ultimately is judged for it. His sons, rather than go with their father, obey the one true God and stand by his side, and then become some of our most common biblical songwriters in the Bible. And some of those Psalms, I think Psalm 46, which you would have read this week, those are written by the sons of Korah. And so it's kind of a cool redemptive story. We've talked a little bit how family and lineage can have influence on one's descendants, right? Who your ancestors are can shape your future in a way, or shape what kind of sins and challenges you may face, or might bring judgment on your family. But I think the sons of Korah are a great example of the fact that the sins of one person are not determinative for his descendants or her descendants. Korah sinned greatly, but his sons remain steadfast, and they become beautiful songwriters in praising God. So kind of a cool thing. I just encourage you to go through the Psalms. If you haven't already, just pay attention to those authorship. And as you get to ones that are written by the sons of Korah, remember those men stood by the Lord even when their own father was trying to bring them to their death. And a really remarkable redemption story. We're also flagged in the census in verse 33 that they're these daughters of Zelophehad. So they're going to come up in the next chapter, but you can see the text is priming us for them, trying to let us know, like, hey, these people are here. We're going to talk about them in a second. We're told that as they get to the promised land, that the larger tribes are going to get a larger inheritance and vice versa. Makes sense. As we divvy up the land and which tribes are going to go where, we're going to make sure everyone fits nicely. And then we're told that there's not one left from the first census in chapter 2 that's still alive now. So what we've just read in this week has encaptured that whole cycle of, we're getting that 40 years through of the people who came out of Egypt, living out the rest of their life, dying either naturally or through one of these judgments of plagues due to their unfaithfulness. And now we have a new generation coming up. In chapter 27, we do look at those daughters of Zelophehad. And it's interesting. So the way that this would work is the land was divvied up by tribes. So this chunk is for Dan, this chunk is for Gad, this chunk is for Judah, so on, so on. And then you'd break up within that by clans, so subgroups. And then you get an allotment eventually for a household. And then that household would be passed down to the sons of that household. And if you were a woman, you would either be in your father's household, and that would be part of your inheritance. Or then if you got married, you would join your husband as part of his household. So basically, everybody had an inheritance or land. Nobody, hopefully, was off on the cold. But there's this idea of the Lord owns all the land, and he's trying to make sure that everybody is secure and taken care of. But these daughters come up and they say, basically, our father had no sons, so why should his inheritance that otherwise we would receive or his lineage would have be given away because he has no sons to pass it down to? And the Lord says, hey, these women are right? Good work, women, on flagging this. And so the way it's going to work is that if somebody has no sons, then it'll go to his daughters. If he has no sons or daughters, it'll go to his brothers. And basically the Lord lays out this whole plan for how land is going to be distributed to try to keep it within the same family lineage, to try and keep it in the same clumps, to try and take care of all people, right? So we don't want anyone being overly abusive with the land or all of this, trying to take care of everybody. So if it's all daughters, the daughters get the land and it's theirs. We're then told Moses is going to die soon. So again, he's not going to get to go to the promised land. So we're told that that's going to be happening. He says to the Lord that these people need a successor for me, that somebody's going to lead them, and that he doesn't want them to be a sheep without a shepherd. And the Lord says that that person will be Joshua. So he should encourage and raise up Joshua. I'll just highlight this. It's beautiful because later we're going to be told in the prophets that the people of Israel are like a sheep without a shepherd, that they are wandering and lost, and that Jesus came to be the good shepherd for all people. And some of you might know this, but the name Jesus literally is just a different language coming from the same name of Joshua. So Joshua being Hebrew, Yahashua being Aramaic. In Greek, it's Jesus. Turning into English, it becomes Jesus. So quite literally, Moses has this moment where he says, the people need a shepherd. And the Lord says, it's Joshua. And then in the New Testament, you have people on this world, a sheep without a shepherd, and God sends them a shepherd called Joshua, who we call Jesus, but same name. So kind of cool preview right here. Chapter 20 and 29, We're given these prescriptions for daily offerings, Sabbath offerings, monthly offerings, Passover offerings, all these different holidays, and all of these different celebrations. And then we close out this week with reading about vows. So one thing you'll notice throughout the Bible, and you'll see this go forward too, people cared a lot more about their word than we probably do today. What you said meant a lot. And it meant a lot that you kept what you said. If you said you were going to do something, if you made a vow, I promised to do X, Y, or Z, there was a lot at stake that you kept that. You were bound to that. It was not something you could easily dismiss or just, I didn't really mean it, or I shouldn't have said that. So there's particular care not to make rash vows or foolish vows, right? You can think of like a moment where you're just like, oh, I swear, like if I could just get this job, then I'd give up all my money. That's a silly example, but the point being like this idea of just making a vague or rash promise without really thinking through what you're willing to commit to was seen as a big no-no. And so your word and what you committed to before the Lord and to others carried a great deal. So in chapter 30, we're told that if you make a vow to the Lord or swear an oath to bind yourself to a pledge, you shall not break your word. Like it's not a question. It's not well, maybe I shouldn't have made that promise, so I can't do it. You keep your oath. You keep your word every time. Especially, in this case, especially men. Men, if you make a promise or a vow, you are bound to it. Now we're told that for women, if you're in your father's household, so you're a young woman, you're not married, you're still in your father's household, you make a rash vow. So make something. I'm so hungry. If I could just get some food, I swear I'd give up my firstborn child, right? That'd be an extreme rash vow, right? If your father rebuked you and said, Susan, you can't say that. That's foolish. Your father had the ability to save you or forgive you from a rash vow. You're not bound to it if he confronts you the day you speak it. So you make that vow. If that day your father hears it and confronts you on it, you are not bound to it. So notice here, there's a difference. If a man makes that same vow, no matter what, every time, he's bound to keep his word. But there's a protection for women that if you make a rash vow, your father, or as you also see in chapter 30, if you get married, your husband has the ability to save you from your careless words. And again, this just goes with the biblical theme that there's a certain responsibility and consequence that comes all wrapped up in one. So we see that in the household, right? So either a father or husband is the head of this household. He has an extra responsibility to care for, to provide for the family. He's a particular role of authority, right? So he is the head, but in doing so, he also bears more responsibility because he's responsible for every word he speaks all the time without fail. And so conversely, if you are a daughter or a wife, if you speak something you shouldn't speak, you are not necessarily bound by that if your father or your husband frees you from that, if he confronts you on that and basically alleviates you from that rash vow. There's a greater responsibility to men to watch their words, if that makes sense. You have a special position of authority, but you have a special responsibility that every word you speak, every promise, every oath, you keep. There's no way out. Okay? It comes with more responsibility because you have more authority, kind of all wrapped up in one. And so then as we round out that chapter 30, then we're closing in on the end of the book of Numbers. And again, today we covered a lot. We covered the people leaving Sinai, getting to the promised land, turning away from the promised land because of this bad report from spies. You have a rebellion. You have Aaron and Miriam rebelling against Moses. You have Moses not honoring God's word and forfeiting his right to the promised land. You have a whole new generation that is raised up, and you have idolatry and Peor. You have a whole lot going on here. But what we see here again is a very imperfect people, and God continues to judge accordingly, but also to forgive and to preserve for himself a people that he's going to eventually bring to the promised land. And as we move into next week, we're going to finish up the book of Numbers, and we're going to move into Deuteronomy, and we're going to kind of get our last little bit before it's time to step into that promised land that we've been reading about for so long. As we close out today, I wanted to respond to a listener question that I thought was really helpful and was a bit thought-provoking for me as well. And so first I want to read the question. This person wrote, question that is tangential to the Exodus readings. The Israelites had hard evidence of God's presence with a pillar of fire, manna, parting the Red Sea, etc., and still struggled to believe. We don't have that hard evidence per se, but more along the lines of changed lives and hearts. What is our view of experiential evidence? It's a really good question. And I think that as I think about that, I want to kind of highlight two aspects to it. And I think it's best done if we stack up the experience of the people of Israel in Exodus and in the early days, and we stack it up with the experience of Christians post-Jesus. So one thing I totally feel this question, because one thing that I also agree with is like, you read this and you're thinking like, you saw the Red Sea part. You saw bread come down from heaven. You saw this pillar of fire and cloud that's moving along. How do you not believe? How do you not stay faithful? But what's interesting, when you stack it up to Jesus's life, we have Jesus performing all of these miracles, and even so far to die and to rise from the dead. And there are eyewitnesses who see Jesus perform these miracles, who see him perform these signs and don't believe. And it's audacious. You're thinking, you saw Jesus help a blind man see. Like, how would you not think like, oh, I'm going to listen to that guy, right? I mean, it's so crazy. In fact, at one point, Jesus raises a man named Lazarus from the dead. And there are some who are so stubborn-hearted that their response is not to say, okay, maybe we should hear Jesus out. Their response is, we need to kill Lazarus because we don't want people seeing him and then believing in Jesus. And so what we see in both the Old and New Testaments is that seeing does not automatically mean believing. That just because you saw a miracle, just because you saw a great work, does not automatically mean you're going to believe in God and stay faithful to him. And so I think as we think this through, it's helpful to point out that, again, two things. One, the people of Israel, not all of them saw all of these miracles, right? As we've seen in the book of Numbers, the generation that saw the Red Sea, the generation that spent most of the time with the manna, and the generation that had this pillar of cloud and fire, they die off before the promised land. Now you're going to have another generation that's going to enter the promised land, and they're going to see God help deliver them in battle. But then you're going to have generations and centuries of Israelites who don't see anything like that. They're not going to see any grand miracle or gesture. And what God has given them is he has given them memorials, he has given them rituals and holidays, and he's given them specifically testimonies. So this is where there's such a huge emphasis in the Old Testament of telling the next generation, whether it's through conversation, whether it is through holidays like the Passover, whether it is through little memorials or monuments like a jar of manna. It's supposed to be a way of one generation communicating to the next what has happened. We used to be slaves in Egypt, and then the Lord did this and this and this, and guess what? Your grandfather was there, and he told me that this happened, and there was frogs and all of this. So there's supposed to be this idea of telling the next generation, because most Israelites are not going to see those great acts. They're going to live and rely off the testimony that has been passed down. The second aspect is that they might still see some of that stuff, or they might see, you could say, a tame manner that might not seem as miraculous. So they hear about the great works in Egypt. They hear about God's deliverance to the promised land. And then on a regular basis, they might see things like God's care through sending the proper rain. He promised us this would be a fruitful land if we were faithful. And guess what? It's an incredibly fruitful land. Wow, this is so good. He promised deliverance from our enemies. And guess what? We're in peace right now. And so there's a certain aspect, two things. One, there's the memorials, the testimony that's passed down. And then there is the lived experience of the continued fulfillment of God's promises, you could say. You map that onto the Christian life. So most of us did not see Jesus walking around performing miracles, and most of us did not see him die on a cross or rise on Easter. Like, I personally have never seen Jesus walking around with his body after his resurrection, right? So I'm going off of faith, right? Because seeing and believing are not exactly one-to-one. And so what we have to go off are kind of the same two things, but I want to start with the more concrete one. And the more concrete one is the testimony that has been passed down. So I did not see Jesus rise from the dead, but a man named John did, At least that's what we believe. And he recorded it for us. And he said, here's what Jesus said. Here's what Jesus did. I did not see Jesus raise somebody from the dead, but John did, and Matthew did, and Peter did, who told his companion Mark, who wrote it down for us. And so what you see here is you have these eyewitnesses, these people who did see these great works and who did believe and receive Jesus, who recorded for us these stories, who recorded for us the acts and the deeds of Jesus. And so we're going off of their testimony, and this is where, just like the people of Israel, there's a certain sense of belief, right? I myself did not see Jesus heal a blind man, but I'm taking the word of those who did see it. And it's not a blind faith. It's not just well, somebody said it, so it must be true. This is where, why do we rely on these? Well, these are people who knew Jesus, who after he died, fled and hid and were scared. And then something happened. They said that Jesus came to them, risen from the dead, and that they had a change of mind. Oh my gosh, everything he said was right. He came back. And we have reason to believe that their witnesses and their manuscripts that record these stories for us are reliable. And that's a whole conversation about apologetics and the history of manuscripts. And I'm happy to answer any questions on that. But it's not a blind faith. It's a reasonable faith, but it's ultimately a faith that's taking somebody's word. The evidence we have is that these people who saw Jesus, who knew Jesus, recorded these stories for us. And the people who saw him and knew him said, yep, that's true, that happened. And that's been passed down for generations through the scriptures and through generations of Christians sharing the good news. Just like the people of Israel, some saw these great mighty acts and they passed it on from generation to generation. And then just like the people of Israel had kind of those lived experiences, the lived, continued, fulfilled promises, I do think that for Christians, we can take some assurance in God's continued promises that, hey, I have seen my life changed. Not that I'm all of a sudden prosperous, but I used to be one way. I used to be very self-centered, or I used to be very bitter and I would never forgive this one person. And only by the grace of God in Jesus have I learned to forgive that person. Have I learned to soften my heart and so on. Or maybe the life of somebody else. Hey, this was somebody who was cold and harsh, and now they're compassionate and warm. And I can attest that to God's word and God's work in their life. And so I'm hesitant to ever make that the foundational thing, right? So our faith is based on Jesus' resurrection. I think that ultimately has to be the main thing, because as in this life, God has changed my life, and yet I'm still also wrestling with my own sin. So if I'm ever putting too much stock in my holiness or in my obedience or in the life of somebody else who also wrestles with sin, at times I might be shaken by that. And so I can look to that as comfort and assurance. And if nothing else, it should be an encouragement for me to want to live a life that bears witness to the truth. Right? I want to live a life that people see and say, man, there's something different there. That is witnessing to another reality, the reality of Jesus. But ultimately, my faith and our faith should be grounded in the evidence and the promise that Jesus rose from the dead. And then as Jesus tells Thomas and the rest of his disciples, after they see him risen from the dead, they didn't believe until they saw, right? And he says, do you believe because you've seen? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. So ultimately, not everyone who saw Jesus believed in him, but some saw him and did believe. And the call for us is to hear their word, hear their news, and to try the best we can, verify how reliable it is, but ultimately to believe that word that has been passed down, that this man, Jesus, ultimately died and rose again. That's the foundation. That's the center. And then the other experiential things, I think, are, a cherry on top. They're an extra aspect to the lived life that we have. I hope that was helpful. If you have any follow-up questions on that or anything I mentioned, please feel free to reach out. But with that, I just want to wish you well. And as always, may the word of Jesus renew you day by day until life everlasting. Happy reading.